Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I had been working at the Museum of Human History in Washington, D.C. for only 7 months, and I still hadn't gotten over the smell. Not a bad smell. More like a mixture of old paper, dust, and climate-controlled air that had passed through more HEPA filters than an operating room. It clung to your clothes and hair. If you worked here long enough, you could step outside into a humid DC summer, take a deep breath, and still taste the faint tang of polished wood and archival glue. Some of the older staff swore they could tell what gallery they were in just by the smell alone. Egyptian wing, pre-Columbian artifacts, the dinosaur hall. I wasn't there yet, but I was getting close. I was finishing the last tour of the day, a group of 8th graders from Theodore Roosevelt Middle School, and they were restless. It was Friday, their stomachs were full of cafeteria pizza, and the final stop, Gallery 42, Empires of the Nile, wasn't exactly where a 13-year-old's mind wanted to be at 3:45 p.m. The main diorama in the center depicted a meticulously reconstructed burial chamber from the 18th dynasty, complete with a gilded replica sarcophagus and wall panels painted in accurate pigments of the era. Fiber optic lighting mimicked flickering oil lamps without the fire hazard. I had just explained the process of mummification in PG-rated terms when someone in the back, probably Malik, the self-appointed class comedian, muttered something about zombies. I ignored it. I'd heard it before. Kids always thought mummies were just ancient zombies wrapped in toilet paper. When the tour wrapped, I herded them down the grand staircase toward the lobby. The marble steps had a faint curve from a century of footsteps, and my own shoes clicked in time with the security guards, Officer Ray Hollister, retired MPD, whose flat gaze could silence even the loudest middle schooler. He held the doors as the chaperones ushered the kids toward their idling yellow school buses. Outside, Constitution Avenue shimmered in the late afternoon heat, traffic crawling toward rush hour. It was almost peaceful. Inside, the museum felt quieter than usual for a Friday. Normally, the last hour before closing saw a trickle of stragglers, tourists reading every placard, parents trying to squeeze in just one more gallery before their kids melted down. But tonight, the upper floors seemed still, even the air felt heavy. "Light crowd," Ray said, locking the lobby doors behind the field trip. "Budget season," I replied. "Fewer school groups." He gave a short nod. "Good for us. Easy night." I signed out the group's tour log and headed back toward the staff corridor behind the Americas Hall. The museum's public spaces were all polished stone and quiet grandeur. The back corridors were pure utility, fluorescent lights, gray-painted cinder block, and the faint mechanical hum of the climate control systems keeping priceless artifacts stable. If you got lost back here, every hallway looked the same. I passed Helen from Collections, who was wheeling a covered cart toward the conservation lab. She was in her 60s, wore thick glasses, and had the permanent posture of someone who had spent decades peering down at fragile manuscripts. "Afternoon, Chris," she said without slowing. "You heading out?" "Yeah, once I drop this radio." I tapped the small walkie clipped to my belt. Tour guides had to check them in after each shift. The staff lounge was nearly empty except for the vending machines humming in the corner. I was just setting the radio in its charging dock when I heard it. Faint from somewhere above, a muffled, irregular thump. At first, I thought it was part of the ongoing maintenance work in the upper galleries. The West Wing skylight seals had been replaced earlier in the week, and scaffolding still lined the mezzanine. But the sound didn't match the steady rhythm of construction. It was uneven dot thump, pause, thump thump. I glanced at the ceiling. The noise came from somewhere near the Hall of Early Civilizations on the 3rd floor. That gallery was closed for the day. The floor plan in my head told me the loading docks were just beyond it, where trucks delivered new exhibits. I almost ignored it. Maintenance wasn't my job. But then the PA crackled overhead. "Security to West Loading Bay. Repeat, security to West Loading Bay." Ray's voice, tight and clipped. That wasn't normal. If it had been a dropped crate or a malfunctioning sensor, he would have called for a facilities tech, not security. I hesitated just long enough to hear the first scream. It was faint, muffled by stone, glass, and 3 floors, but unmistakable. A human scream carries differently than any other sound. It rose, cut off, then was followed by a low guttural noise I couldn't place. I was moving before I realized it, heading toward the service elevator. My brain told me I should just head for the staff exit, but my legs carried me forward. Partly curiosity, partly a bad sense of responsibility. The elevator doors took forever to close, and as it climbed, the noises grew clearer. Not just one scream now, but many. A chorus of panicked shouts echoing off the museum's high ceilings. When the doors slid open on the 3rd floor, the hallway was lit but deserted. The glass entrance to the Hall of Early Civilizations stood ajar, the red "Closed for Maintenance" sign lying on the floor. Beyond, in the shadows between exhibits, something moved. I stepped inside slowly. The gallery's lighting was dim, programmed for evening mode. Spotlights on each display case, the rest in shadow. The noise was louder here. The sharp crash of glass breaking, the heavy slam of a crate tipping over, and somewhere deeper inside, wet, ragged breathing. That's when I saw Ray. He was backing down the corridor, baton in hand, his other arm bleeding heavily. Behind him, 3 figures lurched into view. They moved strangely, jerky, off balance, their heads twitching as if smelling the air. One of them was wearing a museum delivery uniform, but the chest of his shirt was soaked dark, and his mouth hung open far wider than it should have, lips pulled back over broken teeth. "Chris, get out!" Ray barked, stumbling toward me. "Now!" Before I could react, one of the figures lunged and Ray swung his baton hard. The sound of the impact was a sickening crack, but the attacker barely slowed. The next moment, they were on him. I ran, not toward the elevator, too slow, but toward the staff stairwell at the far end of the gallery. My shoes skidded on polished stone as I wove between glass cases filled with Mesopotamian pottery, ducked past the massive Assyrian Lamassu statue, and slammed through the door into the stairwell. My heart was hammering so hard I barely noticed the cut on my forearm until later. Halfway down the stairs, I almost collided with 2 more staff members, Sandra from the front desk and her boyfriend Dan, a part-time maintenance tech. Both were pale and wide-eyed. "Did you see?" Sandra started, but her words were cut off by a sound from above. Not footsteps, more like multiple bodies slamming into the stairwell door. Metal groaned. Dan didn't wait. "Basement," he said, grabbing Sandra's arm. "Go." The 3 of us took the stairs 2 at a time, the echo of our footfalls chased by the sound of the door above buckling. When we reached the bottom, Dan fumbled with his keyring and unlocked the basement corridor. Down here, the air was cooler, drier, and the concrete walls were bare. No exhibits, no windows, just storage rooms and mechanical spaces. We locked the door behind us, but the noises upstairs kept echoing in my skull. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just an accident. And it wasn't over. We had no idea yet that the museum itself would become a trap, one filled with too many hiding places and not enough exits. The basement corridor stretched in both directions, dim fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air down here was different. Cooler but heavier, tinged with the smell of cardboard, varnish, and the faint chemical bite of archival preservation agents. The Museum of Human History stored more in these halls than the public ever saw. Entire collections in rolling steel racks, rare manuscripts sealed inside climate-controlled cabinets, and crates stacked like sleeping giants waiting for their turn in the galleries upstairs. I had been here a few times during training, but the layout was a maze. Some corridors dead-ended in locked conservation labs, others looped back on themselves. It was easy to get lost without landmarks, and tonight, with my pulse still racing, every hallway looked the same. Sandra clung to Dan's arm, her normally neat hair loose around her face. She wasn't speaking, but I could see her eyes darting to every shadow, every closed door, as if something might burst through at any moment. Dan, for his part, kept his jaw set and moved with purpose, though I caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once. We didn't know if the creatures, if that's what they were, could follow us down here. But we'd all heard the metallic groan of the stairwell door upstairs. If they wanted to, they could. We stopped at the first cross corridor and listened. Nothing but the low hum of the ventilation system. Dan motioned left, toward the secure artifact vaults. I wasn't sure why until I remembered. Those vault doors were solid steel, and once closed, they could only be opened with a physical key and a coded access panel. Theoretically, it was one of the safest places in the building, though it was also one of the most isolated. If help didn't come quickly, it could turn into a tomb. We passed through 2 heavy security doors, each requiring Dan's keycard, and stepped into the main vault antechamber. It was a wide, low-ceilinged space with numbered rolling racks in every direction. Each rack was crammed with shelves, acid-free boxes, carved wooden masks from West Africa, bronze spearheads from the Mycenaean period, glass cases filled with delicate textiles. The lighting was intentionally soft to avoid damaging light-sensitive artifacts. The result was a dim, shadowy expanse that seemed to stretch forever. Dan closed the first door behind us and locked it, then moved to the second. I was about to suggest we find something heavier to barricade it when a muffled, rhythmic pounding started echoing through the ventilation ducts above. It wasn't close, but it was steady, and every few beats there was a sharper metallic clang, like a ladder or railing being struck. It carried through the ducts like a drumbeat. We froze, listening. The sound grew fainter, then louder again, as if whatever was making it was moving from one vent shaft to another. I realized, with a cold drop in my stomach, that the museum's ventilation system connected every floor, every wing, including the basement. If they could climb or fit through those spaces, they wouldn't need to find the stairs. Dan pulled us deeper into the racks, past an entire section of Renaissance weaponry locked in glass. Row after row of halberds, pole arms, and swords gleamed faintly in the low light, their blades polished to museum perfection. For a split second, the absurd thought crossed my mind that if we had to defend ourselves, we had the tools right here. But these were priceless artifacts not sharpened for battle, and more importantly, locked away behind tempered glass that would take time and noise to break. We stopped in an alcove near the ethnography collection, where a rolling cart sat half-loaded with boxed items awaiting cataloging. Dan lowered himself onto one of the empty crates and rubbed his face with both hands. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of our situation was sinking in. I could feel it, too. The creeping awareness that we had no idea how many were upstairs. No idea if anyone else had made it out. No idea if the outside world even knew something was wrong inside the museum. We stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, long enough for the pounding in my chest to slow. I could hear Sandra's breathing settle into a shaky rhythm. Then, from the far side of the vault, there was another sound, faint but unmistakable. A quick double tap of footsteps on the concrete floor, followed by the soft scrape of fabric against a rack. All three of us turned toward it at the same time. For a moment, there was nothing, just shadow between the tall shelving units. Then, from between two racks, a small figure emerged, a boy, no older than 12, wearing a rumpled blue hoodie and jeans. His hair was dark and messy, his cheeks flushed, and his eyes locked on us like he'd just found the last safe people in the world. He held something under his arm. At first, I thought it was a thick book, but then I saw the rolled edges and realized it was a large sheet of paper. The kid stopped a few feet away, catching his breath. "You're not with them," he said. Not quite a question, more like confirmation. Dan stood slowly. "Who else is down here?" His voice was low, controlled. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. I've been hiding since it started." He tapped the rolled paper. "I know how to get out." Sandra glanced at me, then back at him. "There's no other exit down here except the loading docks, and those—" She stopped herself because she realized I knew the same thing. The loading docks were near where the attack had begun. The boy unrolled the paper partway, and I saw a section of the museum floor plan, marked with neat pencil lines. But it wasn't like the laminated maps we handed to visitors. It was older, more technical, with notations and cross-sections. He pointed to a shaded area near the center. "This part," he said, "isn't on the public maps, not even the staff ones. My uncle works here, he showed me." His finger traced a line from the basement vaults into what looked like a utility corridor, then down again, below the basement level. Dan leaned over the plan, his brow furrowing. "There's no sub-basement," he said automatically, the way someone repeats training, but his voice didn't sound convinced. The boy's eyes stayed fixed on him. "There is, and it has an exit. Somewhere above us, faint but clear. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the ducts. Then came a long, drawn-out screech of metal tearing. It was closer now, resonating in the concrete like a groan from the building's own bones. The noise made the air feel heavier, as if the museum itself was aware of what was inside it. Dan stood first, scanning the dim vault aisles like a soldier deciding which direction offered the smallest risk. Sandra rose slowly, keeping a hand on the shelving for balance, her gaze darting to every shadow. The boy in the blue hoodie, still holding that rolled blueprint, looked impatient, almost urgent, as though we were wasting seconds we didn't have. Dan gave the faintest nod toward the north end of the vault. We followed the kid through a narrow aisle between two towering rolling racks. The air smelled faintly of old varnish and linen fibers. Somewhere, back in the darkness, something shifted. A soft, deliberate scrape of something heavy brushing metal. I kept moving. My pulse was too loud in my ears to tell if it was footsteps or my imagination. The boy moved like he'd been down here before, hugging the edges of the aisles until we reached a utility door painted the same dull gray as the wall. No sign above it, no visitor would notice it was there. He pulled on the handle, it was unlocked, and we stepped into a narrower service corridor. The lighting was even dimmer here, just bare bulbs behind protective cages, spaced far apart. The smell changed immediately. Gone was the scent of stored artifacts, replaced by cool, slightly damp air that carried the faint mineral tang of concrete that had never fully dried. The kid led us deeper, his sneakers silent on the smooth floor. The corridor angled downward, just enough to feel it in the legs. Pipes ran along the ceiling, some old, corroded, others modern PVC, while thick cables were strapped neatly along the wall, labeled with faded tags. This wasn't part of the public-facing infrastructure. No security placards, no staff-only signs. Just plain, utilitarian space. We walked for several minutes without speaking. The faint noises from the ducts above faded, replaced by a low mechanical hum that felt older than the building's modern systems. It vibrated faintly through the floor, like machinery running somewhere far below. We passed a pair of massive sealed doors on the left. No handles, only recessed locking plates with keyed slots. Whatever was behind them wasn't meant for quick access. The boy didn't even glance at them. Finally, we reached a section where the corridor widened into a small junction. 3 other passages branched away from it, each marked only by painted numbers on the concrete. The kid went straight to the far right one and pointed at a section of wall about 20 feet down. At first glance, it was just more unbroken gray concrete, but as we approached, I could see a faint vertical seam running down one side and a pair of heavy, recessed hinges on the other. Above it, a round ventilation grill was set into the wall, its slats dusty and unmoving. "This is it," he whispered. Not as a secret, but with a strange reverence, like he was repeating something exactly the way his uncle had told him. Dan crouched, running a hand over the seam. He found a recessed latch near the floor, coated in years of grime. It took a hard pull, but the mechanism clicked and the panel swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond it was darkness, thicker than the dim light behind us, swallowing everything. A sharp, dry smell rushed out, like old paper and stale air trapped for decades. The boy stepped in first, clicking on a small flashlight. The beam cut through the black, revealing a narrow stairwell of bare concrete leading sharply down. The walls sweated faintly with condensation in places. I hesitated for half a second, looking back the way we came, and caught a flicker of movement far down the service corridor. It was too brief to make out detail, just the sense of something shifting from shadow to shadow. We went down. The temperature dropped with each step, until it felt like we'd stepped into a basement freezer. The air here was dense, still, and almost perfectly silent except for the faint drip of water somewhere far off. After 3 flights, the stairwell ended in a short landing and a heavy steel door, its surface worn but intact, paint flaking from the hinges. A locking wheel was mounted in its center, like something from an old ship's bulkhead. Dan tried it. It turned smoothly, too smoothly for something that looked this old. Inside, the space opened into a long hall lined with wooden shelving, the kind you'd expect to see in an archive from the mid-20th century. Every shelf was stacked with boxes, thick cardboard ones tied shut with cloth straps, their labels written in careful faded ink. The boy's flashlight swept over a box that read Excav, Cairo, 1937, contents unlisted. Others were marked with similar vague notations. Uncat, 1952 Luxor, unverified Etruria, Private Dawn, 1961, do not display. The place didn't feel abandoned. It felt deliberately hidden. The air was too dry for neglect. The dehumidifiers along the far wall hummed quietly, their indicator lights glowing faint green. Someone maintained this space, even if it wasn't on any map. Sandra trailed her fingers along one of the boxes, almost absently, before pulling her hand back as if the cardboard might burn. "Why hide all this?" she murmured, more to herself than to us. Before anyone could answer, the mechanical hum deepened. Not from the dehumidifiers. This was heavier, lower, coming from somewhere under the floor. A moment later, was another sound, faint but distinct, the muffled thump of something hitting metal in a slow, steady rhythm. It echoed up through the walls. Dan turned to the boy. "This exit you mentioned, where?" The kid raised the flashlight and pointed toward the far end of the archive hall. Past the rows of shelves, a short corridor ended in another steel door, this one smaller, with a simple push bar and no visible lock. He started walking toward it, but halfway down the aisle, the sound changed. The slow, steady thumping became irregular, faster, erratic, as if whatever was striking the metal had realized we were here. The sound carried differently in this place. It wasn't just noise. It seemed to press against the walls, vibrating faintly in the bones of the archive. The boy froze mid-step, his flashlight beam jittering over the shelves. Sandra instinctively moved closer to Dan, while I turned toward the stairwell door, the one we had entered through minutes earlier. It was shut, but the noise was coming from beyond it, and the way the impacts rang against the steel told me the barrier wasn't going to hold for long. Dan didn't hesitate. He motioned us forward toward the far end of the hall. The space between the shelves felt narrower now, and the cardboard boxes seemed to lean in on either side. I could smell the dust we were stirring up, a dry, papery scent that caught in the throat. The humming from the dehumidifiers remained steady, but now I could hear something else beneath it. A faint, wet, irregular breathing that wasn't ours. It came in bursts, like someone struggling to force air through damaged lungs. We passed row after row of labeled boxes. The flashlight's beam caught on details in the ink, references to digs, dates, and locations that spanned continents and decades. Some bore stamped warnings in languages I didn't immediately recognize. I caught one in faded red Cyrillic, and another in blocky French script warning of contamination. None of it slowed us down. Whatever was behind us was too close now. Halfway to the smaller steel door, the thumping from the stairwell stopped. That silence was worse. Every instinct told me it was still there, listening, maybe moving quietly now. Dan urged the boy ahead, but the kid had slowed, looking over his shoulder into the dark aisle behind us. His light caught something that made my stomach tighten. A brief gleam of moisture low to the ground near the end of the shelving. It was followed by a movement so fast it was only a blur, as if something had just pulled back out of sight. We reached the small steel door at the end. Up close, I could see why it had no lock. It wasn't designed as a secure barrier, just a fire exit. Dan pushed it open cautiously, and a rush of cold, stale air rolled in. The space beyond was black, and the beam of the flashlight revealed a concrete tunnel sloping even further downward. The walls were rougher here, not the smooth painted surfaces of museum service corridors, but raw, unpolished concrete that looked older than the rest of the building. The boy slipped inside without hesitation, and we followed, closing the steel door behind us. The tunnel absorbed sound in an unnatural way. Our footsteps seemed muted, and the faint mechanical hum we'd heard upstairs was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The air carried a mineral tang and the faint odor of standing water. Somewhere far ahead, the tunnel curved out of sight. The flashlight's beam was the only point of light in the void. We kept moving, the slope forcing our weight slightly forward. Sandra's breathing was uneven but steady. Dan's posture stayed tense, head turning at intervals to check behind us. Every so often, I glanced back too, half expecting to see movement in the narrow cone of the flashlight, but there was only the tunnel stretching into blackness. After what felt like several minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The walls were brick instead of concrete, their mortar dark with age. The floor was damp in places, small puddles reflecting our light. Old wooden crates, collapsed with age, were stacked haphazardly against one wall, their contents long since rotted away. The ceiling was arched, and rusted iron pipes ran along it, dripping slowly into the puddles below. The whole place felt like a forgotten part of the city's underbelly, something left behind when the museum expanded above. The boy stopped in the center of the room, looking around as if orienting himself. He pointed toward a low archway on the far side. "That way," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It connects to the old service tunnels. My uncle said one leads to an exit under the mall." His words made sense. The National Mall's underground utility corridors were old but real, and a hidden connection from the museum wasn't impossible. Before we could move, the steel door we'd closed behind us clanged sharply, the noise cutting through the chamber like a blade. Something had reached it. The sound of metal under strain filled the tunnel, followed by the shriek of hinges beginning to tear. Dan's eyes locked on the archway and we moved fast. The low passage forced us to stoop, the damp air rushing cold against our faces. The brick was slick to the touch, moss and condensation making the footing treacherous. We emerged into another corridor, narrower, with brick walls coated in lime deposit from years of water seepage. The boy's flashlight beam caught on rusted electrical panels and ancient conduit along the ceiling, none of it active. The slope here was almost imperceptible, but I could feel it. We were still going deeper. The smell of stagnant water grew stronger, and the faint sound of dripping became constant. Somewhere behind us, the steel door gave way with a hollow crash, and the sound that followed was not footsteps. It was a low, gurgling growl that echoed down the brick corridor. It was close enough that the echo came back in less than a second. We didn't run, but our pace doubled. The flashlight's beam wavered with the boy's movement, catching glimpses of side passages that plunged into deeper darkness. The air grew colder, and condensation gathered on my skin. I could feel the walls narrowing slightly, as if the corridor was tightening the further we went. That sound behind us did not fade. It matched our pace exactly, and the echo of claws, or nails, skittered on brick somewhere just out of sight. The boy finally slowed, pressing a hand to the wall at a point where the brickwork changed color. He found a recessed handle disguised in the mortar, pulled, and a panel swung inward on nearly silent hinges. Behind it was another narrow stairway, this one spiraling up instead of down. Cool air drifted down from above, and for the first time since we'd entered the hidden spaces, I smelled something faintly familiar. Fresh paint, maybe even outside air. We filed into the stairwell, and the panel closed behind us just as the growl in the corridor shifted into something worse. A sharp, inhuman screech that bounced up the spiral like it had nowhere else to go. The sound chased us upward, curling around the concrete like smoke. The narrow steps forced us into single file, our breathing loud in the confined space. The boy kept the flashlight steady, its beam cutting tight circles of light on the steps ahead, but my eyes still darted over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see movement below. The spiral was old, the concrete worn smooth at the edges from decades of unseen use, and each footfall sent a faint echo spiraling back down toward whatever was following. The air changed gradually as we climbed, still cold, but with a sharper bite, like the climate control from the museum's main galleries. That faint promise of fresher air gave me a false sense of proximity to safety, but the screeching below reminded me there was no guarantee of that. The sound seemed to rise in pitch when we gained distance, almost like a hunting call, before dipping back into guttural tones. Whatever was down there, it knew we were here, and it wasn't giving up. After what felt like an impossible number of turns, the spiral opened onto a short landing. A heavy steel door, painted the same bland gray as service access points, stood in front of us. A slim strip of light leaked through a narrow ventilation gap at the top. Dan eased past the boy and tried the latch. It wasn't locked, but he held it shut for a moment, ear pressed to the metal, listening. I could hear something, too, muffled, distant noises. Not the creature's call, but softer, irregular movements, and the faint hiss of an air vent. When Dan finally pushed the door open, it swung silently into darkness. The shift from the cold gray of the stairwell to the dim, open space beyond was disorienting. I recognized the scent before my eyes adjusted. Dry wood, aged leather, and the faint chemical tang of preserved fabric. We were inside one of the period galleries. The ceiling here was high, beams lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with towering glass cases and freestanding dioramas. It took a few beats for my brain to match the details. I had been here dozens of times with school groups. This was the 19th century American life exhibit. The gallery was unlit except for a faint spill of artificial daylight from one of the diorama windows. The museum sometimes used these to simulate morning or afternoon and historical street scenes. Here, it cast a pale glow over a recreated cobblestone alleyway flanked by wooden storefronts, each one meticulously staged with mannequins in period clothing. The stillness was absolute, the mannequins frozen mid-gesture, faces painted in lifelike detail that looked far more convincing in the low light than they did under full illumination. We moved inside cautiously, closing the stairwell door behind us. The boy swept the flashlight over the displays, catching a glass glare and throwing warped reflections into the shadows. In that brief light, I noticed something unsettling. The mannequins' eyes were too reflective, catching and holding the beam in a way that made them look like living pupils watching us pass. Sandra slowed, scanning the space. She'd worked the museum's front desk for years, but I could see her mentally cataloging the gallery's layout. This wing was a loop, starting with the small-town Main Street scene, winding through a series of interior vignettes, and ending in a large town hall exhibit before feeding back into the main corridor. It was designed to guide visitors in one direction, but in the dark, the narrow walkways between exhibits felt more like a labyrinth. Dan motioned for us to keep close to the walls. The sound from the stairwell had gone silent, but silence here didn't mean safety. We threaded between the first few storefronts, our shoes soft against the carpeted walkway. Every time the flashlight passed over a display, it lit another frozen tableau. A tailor measuring an invisible customer, a shopkeeper arranging goods, a woman in a bonnet reaching for something on a shelf. The realism that impressed school groups during the day now felt wrong, as if any one of them might turn its head as we passed. Halfway through the gallery, we heard it, a faint click, like a shoe heel on tile from somewhere ahead. The mannequins didn't move, but the sound repeated, closer this time. The boy lowered the flashlight beam instinctively, and without a word, Dan herded us into the nearest diorama. A general store interior, complete with a counter, shelves stacked with replica goods, and two mannequins mid-transaction. We stepped behind the counter, crouching low. The smell here was heavy with aged wood polish and the faint must of stored textiles. Through the dusty front window of the diorama, I could see the main walkway in pale shadow. The footsteps were deliberate now, moving slowly through the gallery. They weren't the uneven, stumbling movements of what we'd seen earlier. These were steady, paced, searching. A tall shadow passed briefly across the light spilling from the cobblestone alleyway scene, then paused, head turning slightly toward our section. My muscles locked. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were scanning each exhibit as they passed. The shadow moved on, swallowed by darkness toward the far end of the gallery. I felt the air shift as Dan exhaled silently. We stayed put for another long minute, listening. In the quiet, I could hear the faint creak of floorboards from the old town hall set piece ahead. That was where the shadow had gone. Dan tapped the boy's shoulder and gestured for us to move. We slipped out from behind the counter, sticking to the deepest shadows along the diorama fronts. The mannequins loomed on either side, their stillness oppressive. Every step forward felt like we were walking deeper into a trap, but the only other way was back toward the stairwell and the screeching thing we'd heard below. When we reached the entrance to the town hall exhibit, the boy stopped. His flashlight stayed low, but in its fringe glow, I saw what made him pause. One of the double doors to the set was slightly ajar, a wedge of blackness behind it. The footsteps had stopped. The sound of breathing was so measured, so deliberate, that for a split second my mind refused to assign it to anything we'd seen so far. It wasn't the ragged, labored rasp of the infected. There was no desperation in it. This was calm, controlled. Whoever was in there was in no hurry, as if they already knew we had no other path but toward them. The boy's grip on the flashlight tightened, and I could feel the tension radiating off him like static. Dan raised one hand slowly, palm flat, and we froze in the narrow strip of space between the museum's fabricated 19th century and the yawning blackness of the town hall diorama. Inside, the shadows seemed heavier than they should have been. I had given tours through this exact section dozens of times and knew its layout by memory. The mock-up stage at the far end, the rows of wooden chairs, the pot-bellied stove in the corner, and the back service door leading to an emergency hall. That back door had always been locked during public hours. Now, I realized with a creeping unease that we didn't know if it still was. The breathing shifted, accompanied by a faint rustle, like fabric brushing wood. The sound came from somewhere near the center of the room. Dan angled his head toward me and mouthed, "Stay low." He stepped forward first, crouching slightly, and I followed, keeping close to the wall. Our feet made no sound on the exhibit's hardwood floor. It wasn't real oak, but a polymer laminate designed to mimic the creak and grain of 19th century boards while meeting safety codes. Still, in this silence, even our careful movements felt too loud. Halfway inside, the smell hit me. Stale sweat and something faintly metallic, like rust left too long in water. My skin prickled. It was too warm in here compared to the climate-controlled chill outside, as if the air hadn't circulated in hours. That was wrong. The museum's HVAC never stopped. The boy's beam flickered briefly over a row of chairs, catching something hunched between two of them. The shape was wrong. Shoulders too high, head tilted at an unnatural angle, but before I could process it, the breathing stopped. The shape uncoiled with a fluidity that didn't belong to anything human and began to rise. Dan didn't speak. He didn't need to. We all took a half step back toward the entrance. The thing's head turned slowly toward the beam's residual glow, and for a fraction of a second I saw the reflection of its eyes. Clouded, but not fully opaque like the others we'd encountered. It was watching us, not blindly reacting, but tracking. Then it moved. It didn't lunge or stumble. It closed the distance in a low, gliding gait, weaving between the chairs without breaking line of sight. The smoothness of it made my chest tighten. It wasn't charging blindly, it was maneuvering, flanking us in a space it already knew. We backed into the aisle, but I could feel the constraints of the set pressing in on both sides, the narrow rows forcing us into predictable paths. Dan grabbed my arm and jerked us toward the stage. The boy and Sandra followed, and we vaulted the low wooden step. Behind us, the thing's pace quickened. Its movements were erratic now, shifting from smooth to twitchy bursts, its limbs snapping too sharply to be natural. It climbed over the chairs instead of taking the aisles, cutting across our retreat line. We reached the back of the stage, where a painted backdrop of a county courthouse loomed above. In the corner, just where I remembered it, was the prop door meant to suggest a back exit. Dan tried the knob. It was stiff but not locked. He pushed through, and a rush of cold air hit my face as we entered a narrow service corridor lined with bare concrete. The boy swung the flashlight down the length of the hall. It stretched maybe 30 meters before ending at a T-junction. This was one of the maintenance access routes I'd only glimpsed during staff orientation, meant for transporting materials between exhibits without passing through visitor areas. It wasn't on the public maps. That gave me a flicker of hope. If we kept moving, maybe we could get clear of the galleries entirely. A thud behind us killed that thought. The thing had followed. It stood just inside the doorway, head lowered, as if gauging the space. Then it stepped forward, one foot dragging slightly, but still faster than anything we could keep ahead of at a walk. Dan didn't waste time. He shoved us down the hall, and we sprinted toward the T-junction. My lungs burned from the sudden cold air, and my legs ached from hours of tension and adrenaline, but fear pushed me forward. We reached the intersection and turned left, following a faint green glow from an illuminated exit sign. This hall was lined with heavy rolling doors, each labeled with a black stencil: crate storage, restoration lab, climate archive. I knew some of these spaces were windowless vaults. In the right one, we could lock ourselves in and wait it out, if we didn't get cornered first. Dan stopped at the third door, labeled Restoration Lab. He yanked it open, and we spilled into a brightly lit room. The sudden light was almost blinding. Stainless steel tables were scattered with tools: scalpels, fine brushes, swabs, bottles of chemical solvents. Along the walls, partially restored artifacts sat in climate cases, fragments of pottery, cracked picture frames, a half-assembled skeleton of some prehistoric mammal. The air was sharp with acetone and ethanol. Dan slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. Almost immediately, something heavy struck the other side. The impact rattled the steel in its frame. Another blow followed, and the entire panel groaned. Whatever it was, it had no intention of leaving. We spread out instinctively, scanning for anything that could be used as a weapon or reinforcement. My hands closed around the handle of a long metal rod used for mounting display supports. Sandra grabbed a steel stool. The boy set the flashlight on a table and began flipping through a flat file drawer, muttering something under his breath. When I asked what he was looking for, he glanced up only long enough to say, "The plans." It took me a second to realize what he meant. He'd seen blueprints here before, real ones, not the simplified public maps. If there was any truth to his earlier claim about parts of the museum not appearing on floor plans, they'd be in this room. Outside, the pounding on the door stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.